Today I'm going to discuss the poem Epitaph on a Tyrant by W.H. Auden, who was a recognized Anglo-American poet born in 1909. And at the time he was writing this poem, he was actually living in Berlin, which was in 1939. And I think, though the poem can, of course, be interpreted on its own, I think one needs to understand the historical context in order to really understand the meaning behind the poem. So to get in a little bit into the historical context, whenever I think of people born in the beginning of the 19th century, I think, oh my god, I'm so happy I'm not them. Because there was a lot going on at that time. You have, of course, World War One. You have the Second Industrial Revolution, especially going on in the United States. And with that came, of course, the Roaring Twenties, and then the Great Depression, which led to a great mistrust in a free economy and in democracy. And I think with that also came the emergence of fascist and communist movements, and then the rise of authoritarian regimes. So with all of this going on, like the Industrial Revolution and the Roaring Twenties on one side, and then war and the Great Depression on the other, you have sort of an odd combination of happiness and hope on one side, but then also desperation and despair on the other. And in addition, in Germany at this time, the government had just prohibited Jews from working as nurses, vegetarians, dentists, etc. And concentration camps started building, and anti-Semitism was really starting to show. So yeah, and in other parts of the world, we are seeing the brutal consequences of demagogues and tyrants like Stalin in Russia and, of course, Mussolini in Italy rising to power. So I think although Auden, since he was living in Berlin at the time, is probably writing about Hitler, I think his poem applies to all tyrants, and I think he's also trying to write sort of a universal description of the characteristics of the tyrants of our time, or of human history. And with that in mind, I think it is much easier to interpret the title, which Epitaph on a Tyrant, I think, can sound a little bit absurd at first, because an epitaph is a writing or a poem about a dead person, typically written on their gravestone. And an epitaph is supposed to hail someone, and it is supposed to be loving and personal and moving. While a tyrant, at least in the modern meaning of the word, is a cruel and oppressive leader. So there's a great oxymoron there, because you wouldn't really want to hail or mourn a tyrant. At least I wouldn't. But I believe the reason why Auden chose this title could be that he himself realized the urgency of the situation at the time that the world was in, whereas other people, the people around him, were more ignorant towards what was happening, thinking that guys like Hitler and Mussolini would be their saviors. And I think another perspective could be that since an epitaph is typically written about a dead person, Auden's poem may be what he pictures people will say in hindsight of the war, when the world had seen the brutal consequences of authoritarian leaders rising to power. So moving on to the actual poem, which is very short. It only has one stanza consisting of 6 lines, but I think it is still full of meaning, so that is what I'm going to discuss now. The first line reads, "Perfection of a kind was what he was after," end quote. And by perfection of a kind here, I think Auden may emphasize that whatever he or the tyrant is after is either wrong or unrealistic, because either something is perfect or it is not. And I regard perfection as something that can perhaps only exist in our minds. Hence, I think the meaning behind the line is that tyrants and extremists often seek a utopian reality. In Russia, for example, in the interwar period, Stalin wanted to create a world in which millions and millions of different people with different strengths, backgrounds, religions, and thoughts were all the same. And if this was possible, then communism would probably have succeeded by now, I think. But the perfection of a kind in this poem, however, I think is Hitler's utopian idea of the perfect nation consisting only of the immaculate Aryan race. Although, of course, of a kind can also mean that the tyrant just has a very different conception of perfection than the rest of us, and that this subjective view is so absurd that it is impossible for the majority to comprehend. Which leads me to the next line, which reads, "And the poetry he invented was easy to understand." And I think, first of all, here Auden may want the tyrant to come across as slightly arrogant, because you cannot really invent poetry, you can only create it. And then furthermore, poetry is usually complex and it requires reading between the lines for proper understanding. And although the tyrant may have a complex master plan to achieve his perfection of a kind, I think the way the tyrant presents his idea to the masses is very easy to understand. And I think this line implies that the tyrant is really a populist and a demagogue with a lack of a substantial ideology, and that Auden points out that politicians do not really need statistics and facts to be persuasive. And on the contrary, facts can actually push people away because it can get too complicated very fast, and there is no guarantee that people will understand what the politician is saying nor find what he is saying interesting. In the movie Inception, there is actually a line that I think is relevant in this context. And the movie is about planting an idea in someone's mind. And the main character says at one point, quote, "We need the simplest version of the idea in order for it to grow naturally in your subject's mind. That's a very subtle art," end quote. And I think that is exactly what Auden implies here, that humans search for ideas that are simple rather than complex facts and figures, because it is the simple things that stick to our minds. Hence, using simple logical fallacies and polarizing rhetoric can be much more captivating and effective to try and persuade someone. Which actually leads me to the third line, which reads, "He knew human folly like the back of his hand." And what's interesting here, I think, is that Auden does not only criticize the tyrant, but he is also criticizing the naivety of the people. I think human folly can refer to how easily humans can be and fooled into supporting extreme ideas if only the situation is right and as long as the right feelings are provoked. And also another perspective of this line is that if the people's foolishness is at the back of the tyrant's hand, it can mean that human foolishness is hidden for everyone but him. So he is the only one who understands what really is going on, which gives him, of course, immense power distributed on very few hands, actually just one hand, if you're gonna read the poem literary. And I also think that this simile can suggest that the key to being a demagogue is knowing people's foolishness and also knowing that people tell small lies all the time. Hence, small lies are often easier to disclose. Therefore, Hitler actually said, quote, "Make the lie big, make it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it," end quote. So I think in the interwar period, especially, people were in an unusual state of hopefulness and future optimism on one hand, yet also fear and anger I spoke about earlier. And hope and anger are two very strong sentiments, which of course makes people vulnerable. And vulnerable people are often also susceptible to manipulation. Hence, I think the atmosphere in the world at that time provided a fertile soil for human folly and tyranny and also extreme ideas. So I'm not sure if you can really blame people for falling for these tyrants like Auden is doing here. And furthermore, in the poem, Auden says, he was greatly interested in armies and fleets, and when he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter. And here I think the reason for the senators' laughter could be that the senators are underestimating the tyrant and his power, which was actually the case when extremist movements started rising during the interwar period, during the Great Depression. But on the other hand, I think the reason for the senators' laughter could also be the fear of opposing the tyrant. Apparently, when Stalin held speeches, the applause felt everlasting because no one dared to be the first one to stop clapping because they were afraid that they were going to get killed. And also, there's also a fragment of irony in this line when Auden uses the word respectable, because so hard to say, senator is obviously an honorable title given the senators fulfill their role, but we do not respect senators who are too afraid to stand up for their own country. So they are cowards rather than respectable. And again, this is actually a critique of the people rather than the tyrant himself, because the cowards who stand beside the tyrant and laugh and applaud are actually the ones making the tyrant's charade possible in the first place. And then in the last line, which I feel the whole poem builds up to, shows that the consequences of the senator's failure to stand up against the tyrant is felt by the weakest link of society, who are the little children. So the last line here reads, and when he cried, little children died in the streets. And my immediate reaction to this line was the stark contrast between senators burst with laughter and little children died in the streets. And with this contrast, I think Auden really describes the great power of the tyrant, because he literally controls the population with the back of his hand, as I spoke about earlier. He shows no mercy, and a slight change in the tyrant's mood can be lethal. So the poem's sudden tone shift here can symbolize how fast the tyrant can go from a little boy interested in armies and fleets to killing innocent children. To sum everything up, I'm sorry, this is very long. I think that Auden did a great job summing up the characteristics of a tyrant, because when we look at history, sadly, these characteristics are true regardless of time, and I think it is especially relevant today when we look at Donald Trump's presidency. He has a lot of the characteristics described in this poem, I believe. He, first of all, is greatly interested in armies and fleets, and being the president of law and order. He certainly knows human folly like the back of his hand, and he has a very polarizing rhetoric that is easy to understand. So yes, thank you.